The world watched in awe as centuries of royal tradition unfolded with flawless precision, but behind the gilded walls, something went terribly wrong. A single disagreement, quiet, controlled, almost invisible, triggered a chain reaction no one saw coming. By the end of the ceremony, alliances had shifted, trust had fractured, and one royal decision would send shockwaves through the monarchy, setting the stage for a confrontation no one could contain. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. From the outside, everything appeared untouchable. The ceremony moved with a rhythm perfected over generations. Every word measured, every gesture rehearsed, every presence deliberate. It was a moment designed to reassure the world that stability still reigned at the heart of the monarchy. And yet, beneath that carefully constructed image, something far more fragile was beginning to crack. Those closest to the center of power could feel it not in dramatic outbursts, but in the silence between interactions, in the hesitation before a glance was returned, in the way certain voices seemed colder than they should have been on a day meant to symbolize unity. There were moments small, almost forgettable to the untrained eye when the energy shifted. A pause that lingered just a second too long. A gesture that felt restrained rather than natural. And in those moments, the truth quietly surfaced. Not everyone stood in agreement. Princess Anne, known for her unwavering discipline and loyalty to tradition, carried herself with a tension that was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Across from her, Camilla held her position firmly, composed yet unmistakably distant, as if standing behind an invisible boundary that had only just been drawn. At the center of it all stood Prince William. The future pressed heavily into the present. His role, already significant, suddenly carried a different weight, one shaped not just by expectation but by conflict. Because what was unfolding wasn't simply a matter of ceremony. It was something deeper, something rooted in power, legacy, and control. And the moment that changed everything didn't arrive with spectacle, it arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the form of a last-minute shift. A decision. A change that, to the public, meant nothing, but to those inside the system, meant everything. Confusion spread among palace aides in hushed tones. Adjustments were made quickly, almost urgently, as if trying to correct something before it became visible. But it was already too late. The balance had been disturbed. What had once been predictable was now uncertain, and those responsible for maintaining order were scrambling to contain something they didn't fully understand themselves. Because this wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't written. And in a world governed by tradition, the unwritten is where danger begins. What made it more unsettling was the realization that this wasn't an isolated moment. It didn't feel accidental. It felt inevitable, like the surface had finally cracked under pressure that had been building long before this day ever arrived. And for those paying attention, the question was no longer whether something had gone wrong but how far it would go. Because once trust begins to fracture at the highest level, it doesn't stay hidden for long. And as the ceremony continued, polished and composed, the truth remained buried just beneath the surface. Waiting. Waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained, when the silence would finally give way to something far louder, far more destructive than anyone had anticipated. But what the world didn't realize was that this tension didn't begin on Coronation Day. It had been quietly building for months, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. Long before the crown touched the king's head, a silent war was already underway, one fought not with words, but with influence, loyalty, and legacy. Princess Anne, known for her unwavering discipline, had been watching, calculating. And Camilla, stepping into unprecedented power, was making moves that didn't sit well with everyone. What seemed like polite distance was, in truth, a brewing conflict that would soon erupt in the most public way imaginable. The tension did not appear overnight. It was rooted in something far deeper than personality or preference. It was about the direction of the monarchy itself. Princess Anne had spent her entire life embodying a system built on duty, structure, and unwavering respect for tradition. For her, the monarchy was not something to be reshaped according to circumstance. It was something to be preserved, protected, and passed forward with precision. But the world had changed, and with that change came new influences, new expectations, and most importantly, new voices none more significant than Camilla's. Camilla's rise was not just symbolic. It was strategic, deliberate, and quietly transformative. With the queen gone, the balance of influence had shifted, leaving space for a new kind of authority to take hold. And Camilla did not hesitate to step into that space. Her approach was different, less rigid, more adaptive, more willing to adjust the monarchy's image to fit a modern world that no longer accepted tradition without question. To some, it felt necessary. To others, especially Anne, it felt dangerous. Because what Camilla represented wasn't just change, it was uncertainty. And uncertainty within an institution built on predictability is where conflict begins to grow. Anne could see it happening, not through grand declarations, but through smaller, more subtle shifts. Meetings where her presence was no longer considered essential. Decisions that once required her input now moved forward without consultation. Conversations that used to include her suddenly took place behind closed doors, leaving her informed rather than involved. And while none of these moments alone were enough to spark confrontation, together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Inside royal circles, the atmosphere began to change. What was once warm familiarity became measured politeness. Interactions grew shorter, more calculated, as if everyone was aware of something they couldn't openly address. There were no arguments, no visible fractures, just a quiet, persistent distance that seemed to widen with each passing week. Palace insiders would later describe it as a shift in energy, a sense that something fundamental had changed, even if no one was willing to say it out loud. At the center of this growing divide stood Prince William, navigating a path that grew more complicated by the day. He understood Anne's perspective, her commitment, her discipline, her belief in protecting the institution at all costs. But he also recognized the reality that Camilla represented a monarchy that needed to evolve if it was to survive. And in trying to balance those two forces, William found himself caught in a position that offered no easy resolution. Because every decision, no matter how small, carried weight. Every alignment signaled something deeper. What made the situation even more volatile was the fact that none of this had been resolved. There had been no confrontation, no moment of clarity where positions were openly declared. Instead, everything remained beneath the surface, unspoken, but deeply felt. And that silence allowed the tension to grow unchecked, building pressure with nowhere to release. So when the final preparations for the coronation began, the stage was already set, not for celebration, but for collision. Because all it would take was one decision, one moment where those opposing forces could no longer coexist quietly for everything to come crashing into the open. And when those buried tensions collided with a critical coronation decision, it wasn't just a disagreement, it was the spark that ignited everything. It started with a decision, one that seemed small on the surface, almost procedural. But in royal terms, it carried enormous weight. When Prince William made his choice, it instantly divided the room. Loyalties were tested, lines were drawn. And in that moment, Princess Anne realized something she couldn't ignore, while Camilla saw an opportunity she couldn't resist. What followed wasn't just disagreement, it was open defiance, unfolding in real time. The decision itself did not arrive with drama. There was no announcement, no grand declaration. It came quietly, almost casually, delivered as part of final adjustments in the hours leading up to the coronation. But within that quiet change was a shift in meaning, one that altered expectations in a way only those deeply embedded in royal protocol could truly understand. It wasn't just about positioning or sequence. It was about recognition, authority, and the subtle signals that define power within the monarchy. And the moment it was understood, the atmosphere changed instantly. Princess Anne reacted first, not loudly, but firmly. Her objection was immediate, rooted in principles that had guided her entire life. To her, this was not a flexible matter. Protocol existed for a reason. It preserved order, protected legacy, and ensured that no individual could quietly reshape the institution according to personal preference. Her words, measured yet unyielding, carried the weight of decades of service. This was not resistance for the sake of control, it was resistance for the sake of preservation. But what made this moment different was that her stance did not settle the matter, it intensified it. Because Camilla did not step back. Instead, she stepped forward. Where Anne saw a breach, Camilla saw progress. Where Anne saw risk, Camilla saw necessity. And in supporting William's decision, she did something that could not be undone. She positioned herself not as a passive figure within the structure, but as an active force shaping it. Her response was calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm. This was not negotiation. This was assertion. What followed was a confrontation that remained hidden from public view, but reverberated through every corridor of the palace. The discussion escalated quickly, not because of raised voices alone, but because of what those voices represented. This was no longer about a single decision. It was about competing visions of what the monarchy should be. Anne, standing as the embodiment of continuity, refused to compromise. Camilla, representing adaptation, refused to retreat. And between them stood William, facing the full weight of a choice he could no longer soften or delay. For William, the moment was suffocating. What had begun as a decision grounded in practicality now carried emotional consequences he could not ignore. He understood Anne's frustration, her sense that something foundational was being altered without proper respect. But he also recognized the pressure to move forward, to signal that the monarchy was not frozen in time. And in that tension, he found himself pulled in both directions, knowing that whatever he chose, he would fracture something that could not easily be repaired. Those present would later describe the atmosphere as urgent, almost volatile. Conversations overlapped, positions hardened, and for a brief moment, the carefully maintained control that defined the royal household slipped, revealing something far more human: frustration, conviction, and the unmistakable edge of conflict. Anne's refusal to yield marked a rare and striking break from her usual composure, while Camilla's unwavering stance made it clear that she was no longer willing to operate in the background. And just like that, the line had been crossed. Not publicly, not visibly, but definitively. Because once authority is challenged at that level, it cannot simply return to what it was before. The decision remained in place, but the cost of that decision had only just begun to unfold, setting the stage for consequences that would reach far beyond that private confrontation. But while that clash remained hidden from public view, its consequences couldn't stay buried, and the coronation itself would become the battlefield. To the world, the ceremony was flawless, every movement choreographed, every word delivered with precision. But to those watching closely, something felt off. A missed glance, a delayed gesture, a moment of hesitation that lasted just long enough to raise questions. These weren't mistakes, they were signals. And together they revealed a silent clash unfolding right in front of millions. At first it was easy to dismiss. The scale of the occasion demanded perfection. And what the public saw was exactly that: a seamless display of unity, dignity, and continuity. But beneath that surface, something far more fragile was being tested. The tension that had erupted behind closed doors did not disappear when the ceremony began. It followed them into every step, every exchange, every carefully measured interaction. And the closer you looked, the harder it became to ignore. There were moments when Princess Anne and Camilla appeared aligned in position but disconnected in presence. Not dramatically, not in a way that would disrupt the ceremony, but subtly enough to create a sense that something wasn't quite right. Their movements, though precise, lacked the natural ease expected of such a moment. It was as if each gesture carried an unspoken weight, as if every action had been recalculated in real time. The absence of direct acknowledgement between them did not go unnoticed by those trained to read between the lines. Even more revealing was the silence between those moments. Eye contact that never quite happened. Expressions that remained composed but distant. The kind of restraint that only exists when something is being deliberately held back. Because in a system built on control, what isn't shown can be just as powerful as what is. And here, what wasn't shown spoke volumes. Prince William moved carefully through it all, balancing more than anyone could see. His interactions were measured, almost deliberate in their neutrality. He maintained the rhythm, kept the structure intact, ensured that nothing visibly broke, but beneath that composure was the unmistakable pressure of someone navigating a situation that could not be resolved in the moment. His role had shifted from participant to mediator, even if no one had officially acknowledged it. Then came a moment, small, fleeting, but impossible to ignore once recognized where the expected flow of protocol seemed to falter. It wasn't announced. It wasn't explained. But for those familiar with the structure, it stood out immediately. Something had been adjusted. Not enough to disrupt the ceremony, but enough to signal that the earlier decision, the one that sparked the confrontation, had carried through into the public stage. And in that instant, the private conflict became part of the public narrative, even if only a few truly understood it. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere told a different story. Those within the palace would later describe it as controlled chaos, an environment where everything appeared stable, yet felt anything but. Adjustments were made quietly. Communication became sharper, more urgent. There was no panic, but there was awareness. Awareness that something had shifted in a way that could not simply be undone. And as the ceremony concluded, the outside world began to react. Speculation surfaced almost immediately. Analysts, commentators, and observers began piecing together the subtle inconsistencies, the moments that didn't quite align. What had seemed flawless at first glance now carried an undercurrent of tension that couldn't be fully explained but couldn't be ignored either. Because the truth was becoming impossible to contain. What had happened was not just a disagreement. It was a fracture, one that had revealed itself in the smallest of ways, yet carried consequences far larger than anyone was willing to admit. And the most unsettling part was not what had been seen, but what it suggested. That something irreversible had begun. And once the ceremony ended, the real fallout began because Anne wasn't willing to let this go quietly. For decades, Princess Anne had been the monarchy's most disciplined figure, steady, unshakable, immune to drama. But this time was different. This time, something crossed a line. And when Anne decided to act, she didn't do it halfway. What followed wasn't just a reaction, it was a statement. A bold, unmistakable signal that she would not accept what had just happened, no matter the consequences. The moment the ceremony ended, the silence around her was no longer the controlled silence of protocol, it was the silence of calculation. For years, Anne had operated within the system with precision, choosing restraint over confrontation, loyalty over personal assertion. But what unfolded during the coronation had altered something fundamental within her. It wasn't just disagreement. It was the realization that the very structure she had dedicated her life to protecting was being reshaped without the respect it demanded. And that realization ignited something she could no longer suppress. Her shift was immediate, but not impulsive. It was measured, deliberate, and rooted in conviction. Where she had once observed quietly, she now moved with purpose. Conversations that followed were no longer passive exchanges, they carried weight, direction, and a clear message. This would not be ignored. Those closest to her could sense it instantly. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Anne had drawn a line, and for the first time in years, she was prepared to defend it openly. Behind closed doors, the tone of discussions changed dramatically. What had once been polite, carefully balanced dialogue now carried an unmistakable edge. Anne spoke with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. This was not about preference or perspective. This was about principle, about preserving something she believed was being compromised. And in those conversations, she made it clear that the events of the coronation were not just concerning, they were unacceptable. The emotional weight of that decision was not lost on her. Anne understood exactly what it meant to take this stance. She understood the disruption it would cause, the questions it would raise, the tension it would amplify. But for her, the alternative, remaining silent, carried a far greater cost. Because silence, in that moment, would have been acceptance. And acceptance was something she refused to offer. Within the royal household, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Shock spread quickly, followed by confusion and a growing sense of unease. This was not the Anne they were accustomed to navigating around. This was someone who had stepped beyond quiet loyalty into something far more assertive. Staff members, advisors, even senior figures found themselves uncertain of how to respond, because the usual methods of maintaining balance no longer applied. The dynamic had shifted, and no one could predict where it would settle. At the center of this growing tension stood William, increasingly aware that the situation was moving beyond control. Anne's stance placed him in a position he could no longer navigate with neutrality. Every conversation, every decision now, carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. And while he had hoped the situation might stabilize after the ceremony, it was becoming clear that it had only just begun. Camilla, too, recognized the shift. The earlier confrontation had been intense, but contained. This was different. This was escalation. Anne's actions were no longer confined to disagreement, they were moving toward something far more decisive. And that realization brought with it a new level of urgency. Because once such a line is drawn, it rarely disappears without consequence. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. A decision made with precision, carrying a message that could not be misinterpreted. It was the point where objection turned into action, where tension transformed into something tangible. And once that step was taken, there was no returning to what had been before. And that decisive move would soon become impossible to ignore. Because Anne didn't just object, she acted in a way no one expected. In a monarchy built on tradition, every action carries meaning, but this one was unprecedented. Princess Anne didn't issue a statement. She didn't hold a meeting. Instead, she made a move so bold, so unmistakable, that it sent shockwaves through the palace. Camilla was cut off in a way that shattered royal norms and forced everyone to take sides. What made this moment so powerful was not just the action itself, but what it represented. In royal terms, blocking was not a simple gesture, it was a deliberate severing of access. A calculated withdrawal of cooperation that disrupted the very flow of communication the institution relied on. It meant doors that were once open were now closed. Messages that once moved freely were now redirected, delayed, or stopped entirely. It was not loud, but it was absolute. And within a system built on quiet coordination, that kind of disruption carried enormous weight. The impact was immediate. Internal operations, once seamless, began to fracture under the strain. Staff members found themselves caught between conflicting instructions, unsure which authority to prioritize. Meetings that required alignment became tense, uncertain, sometimes postponed altogether. The efficiency that defined the palace started to slip, not because of chaos, but because of division. And division, within such a tightly controlled structure, was something no one had prepared for. For those working behind the scenes, the shift was disorienting. There were no official announcements, no formal explanations, just a sudden change in how things worked. People who had spent years navigating the system found themselves questioning it. Lines of communication that had always been clear were now blurred. And with every passing hour, it became more obvious that this was not temporary. This was a statement being enforced in real time. Camilla's response was measured, but the impact on her position was undeniable. She did not react publicly. She did not escalate in visible ways. But the silence surrounding her response carried its own intensity. Because to be blocked in this way was not just inconvenient, it was symbolic. It signaled resistance. It signaled rejection. And perhaps most significantly, it signaled that her authority was no longer universally accepted within the inner circle. At the center of it all, William stood in a position that grew more precarious with every moment. What had once been a delicate balance had now become a clear divide. Anne's move forced a reality that could no longer be ignored. Neutrality was slipping out of reach. Every decision he made, every interaction he had, now carried an implicit alignment. And the longer the situation remained unresolved, the more pressure built around him to act. But beyond the immediate disruption, the deeper significance of Anne's decision began to take shape. This was not just about communication. It was about power, about who held it, who challenged it, and how far those challenges could go. By taking this step, Anne had done something rare within the monarchy. She had openly defied the evolving structure, not through confrontation, but through action. And that action carried a message that echoed far beyond the palace walls. Because it didn't stay contained for long. Whispers turned into leaks. Leaks turned into headlines. The narrative began to form, piece by piece, as the outside world caught glimpses of what was unfolding inside. And as those glimpses spread, the perception of unity that had defined the monarchy began to shift. What was once seen as stable now appeared uncertain. What was once controlled now felt exposed. And in that exposure, the true scale of the fracture became impossible to deny. This was no longer a private disagreement. It was a visible divide, one that raised questions not just about relationships, but about the future of the institution itself. But as the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, one question loomed larger than ever: whose side would William ultimately choose? Caught between two powerful forces, Prince William found himself facing a choice that could define his future. On one side stood Princess Anne, unyielding, principled, and deeply respected. On the other, Camilla, firmly embedded within the new royal order. This wasn't just about loyalty, it was about legacy. And whatever decision William made, it would shape the monarchy for years to come. What made the situation unbearable was not just the pressure from others, it was the conflict within himself. William had always understood that leadership in the monarchy required balance, patience, and the ability to unify. But now, unity felt impossible. The divide before him was too sharp, too personal, too deeply rooted in opposing visions of what the institution should become. Anne represented everything stable, everything time-tested, everything that had held the monarchy together through decades of uncertainty. Camilla, on the other hand, represented movement, adaptation, survival, the willingness to reshape tradition in order to protect it from irrelevance. And standing between them, William realized that choosing one meant, in some way, rejecting the other. Advisors circled closely, their urgency impossible to ignore. They spoke in measured tones, but the message was clear: this situation could not continue unchecked. Stability had to be restored, and quickly. Every hour of silence allowed the tension to deepen, allowed speculation to grow, allowed the perception of division to take root both inside and outside the palace. But their solutions, though logical, did not ease the weight on William's shoulders, because this was not a problem that could be solved with strategy alone. It required a decision, a definitive alignment, and that was where everything became complicated. Emotionally, the cost of that decision was enormous. Anne was not just a senior royal, she was a figure of unwavering loyalty, someone who had dedicated her life to the institution without hesitation or compromise. To oppose her would not just be a political move, it would feel like a betrayal of everything she stood for. Yet standing against Camilla carried its own consequences. She was not only part of the present structure of power, she was central to it. To challenge her position would risk destabilizing the very framework William was expected to inherit and eventually lead. Beyond the private struggle, there was the unrelenting pressure of public expectation. To the outside world, William represented the future, a future that demanded clarity, strength, and direction. But what the public could not see was how fractured that future felt in this moment. Because behind the image of composure was a reality filled with doubt, hesitation, and the growing realization that there was no path forward that did not come at a cost. And still, there were signs, subtle, almost imperceptible, of where his thoughts were beginning to lean. Not through declarations, but through small shifts. The tone of certain conversations, the timing of certain decisions, the way he positioned himself in moments that required quiet judgment rather than visible action. These were not answers, but they were indications. And for those watching closely, they suggested that William was beginning to understand something unavoidable, that neutrality, once his strongest position, was no longer sustainable. Because inaction carried its own consequences. The longer he remained between both sides, the more the divide solidified around him. What had once been a conflict between two figures was slowly becoming a test of his leadership, a test of whether he could step forward, define a direction, and accept the consequences that came with it. And as that realization settled in, the weight of the moment became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about resolving tension. It was about defining the future. About deciding whether the monarchy would lean toward preservation or transformation. And understanding that whichever path he chose, it would leave a lasting mark, not just on those involved, but on the institution itself. And as William wrestled with that impossible choice, the palace itself began to change, because this conflict was no longer contained behind closed doors. What began as a private disagreement had now evolved into something far more dangerous, a divide that threatened the very structure of the monarchy. Staff whispered. Alliances shifted. Even the most loyal insiders began to question what would happen next. The palace, once a symbol of unity, now felt like a house divided, and the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The change did not arrive with a single announcement. It spread quietly, almost invisibly at first, through conversations that ended too quickly, through decisions that no longer aligned, through the subtle but unmistakable formation of sides. Within the royal household, a line had been drawn not officially, not openly, but clearly enough that everyone could feel it. And once that line existed, it began to shape everything. Staff members, long accustomed to operating within a seamless system, found themselves navigating unfamiliar territory. Instructions that once came with clarity now carried uncertainty. Questions that once had straightforward answers now required careful consideration: who had the authority to decide, and whose direction should take precedence. It was not chaos, but it was something just as destabilizing: hesitation. And in an institution that relied on precision, hesitation became a problem that could not be ignored. As days passed, the divide became more defined. Some aligned themselves with Anne's unwavering stance, drawn to her clarity, her conviction, her refusal to compromise what she believed was essential. Others leaned toward Camilla, recognizing the necessity of adaptation, the importance of moving forward rather than holding on to structures that could no longer remain untouched. These were not loud declarations of loyalty, but quiet alignments, subtle shifts in behavior, in communication, in trust. Outside the palace, the narrative was beginning to take shape in ways that could no longer be controlled. Media coverage intensified, speculation grew sharper, and what had once been whispers turned into full conversations. Analysts dissected every detail, every interaction, every perceived inconsistency, searching for meaning behind the silence. And as those interpretations spread, the image of unity that had defined the monarchy began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of instability that the public could not fully understand, but could certainly feel. That shift in perception carried its own danger. Because the monarchy was not just sustained by structure, it was sustained by belief. And once that belief began to weaken, even slightly, the consequences could extend far beyond internal conflict. Questions emerged, not just about the individuals involved, but about the institution itself. Could it adapt without breaking? Could it maintain tradition without becoming rigid? Could it survive a divide that had become so visible, even without being fully explained? Behind the scenes, efforts to contain the situation intensified. Senior figures moved carefully, attempting to mediate without escalating, to restore balance without forcing resolution. Conversations took place in quieter rooms, in controlled environments, where every word was chosen with precision. But even these attempts carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, because the deeper truth was becoming harder to ignore. This was not a misunderstanding that could simply be clarified. It was a fundamental difference in perspective, one that had been pushed into the open and could not easily be reversed. And as those efforts continued, a realization began to settle in among those closest to the center of power. Reconciliation, once assumed to be inevitable, no longer felt guaranteed. The gap had widened too far, the positions had hardened too deeply, and the stakes had grown too high. What had once been a temporary fracture now carried the weight of something far more lasting. There was a sense, quiet but undeniable, that the monarchy was stepping into unfamiliar territory. A place where tradition alone could not provide answers, where authority was being tested in new ways, and where the outcome was no longer predictable. And in that uncertainty, one truth became impossible to ignore: the path forward would not look like the past. And as the divide deepened, one final question remained: was this a temporary fracture, or the beginning of something irreversible? The dust may have settled, but the impact of that coronation dispute continues to ripple through the monarchy. Relationships have shifted, trust has been tested, and the future now feels uncertain in ways it never did before. What happened between Anne, Camilla, and William wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point, and its consequences may shape the royal family for generations. What remains now is not the noise of confrontation, but the weight of what followed. Because while the visible tension has eased, the underlying shift cannot be undone. The monarchy, once defined by a sense of unshakable continuity, now carries a new reality, one shaped by conflict that was not only exposed, but acted upon. And in that shift, every relationship within the institution has been quietly recalibrated. Princess Anne's position, once understood as steady and unwavering, has taken on a new dimension. She is no longer seen only as the embodiment of duty, but as a figure capable of decisive resistance when the institution itself is at stake. That transformation has solidified her authority in a different way, not through hierarchy, but through conviction. She has become both respected and formidable, a presence that cannot be overlooked or sidelined without consequence. At the same time, Camilla's role has entered a phase of deeper scrutiny. Her influence remains, but it now exists within a more complicated landscape. Every decision, every movement forward, is viewed through the lens of what has already happened. Where there was once quiet acceptance, there is now careful observation. And that shift, though subtle, changes everything. Because authority, once questioned, does not easily return to its original form. For William, the transformation is perhaps the most profound. The conflict has forced him into a space where leadership is no longer theoretical, it is immediate, personal, and unavoidable. The choices he faced, and the ones he continues to face, are shaping him in real time. Not just as a royal figure, but as a future king who must navigate a monarchy that is no longer as unified as it once appeared. His identity is being forged not in moments of stability, but in moments of tension, where every decision carries lasting impact. Beyond the palace walls, the fascination has not faded. If anything, it has grown stronger. The public, once presented with an image of seamless unity, now watches with a different perspective, one that seeks to understand the fractures beneath the surface. Speculation continues, questions linger, and the story refuses to settle into a simple narrative. Because what unfolded was not just an internal disagreement, it was a glimpse into a system adjusting under pressure. And within that system, adaptation has already begun. Not openly, not dramatically, but in quieter ways. Adjustments in communication. Shifts in influence. A more cautious approach to decisions that once would have moved forward without hesitation. The monarchy is changing, not because it chose to, but because it has been forced to respond to something it can no longer ignore. Yet even with those changes, uncertainty remains. There are questions that have not been answered, tensions that have not been fully resolved, and a sense that what has happened is only part of a larger story still unfolding. Because when something this significant occurs within an institution built on tradition, it does not simply fade, it lingers, shaping the future in ways that are not immediately visible. And that is where the true impact lies. Not in what has already happened, but in what it suggests. That the monarchy, for all its history and structure, is not immune to division. That even within its most controlled environment, moments of defiance can emerge, and once they do, they leave a mark that cannot be erased. Because in a family where tradition defines everything, one moment of defiance can echo forever, and this story may not be over yet. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.